with a colleague of mine from back in the day, back in the cloud camp day, still going strong. Dave Nielsen, how are you, sir?
Hey, doing pretty good. Glad to be on your show.
I'm going to put this in gallery view so we can see you. I'm going to turn off my phone here. So, Dave, you're back. You're back at Redis, and Redis is now in a pretty interesting position. I remember the earliest days of Redis when it was starting to get adopted and it went to AWS, and now it's part of the story that we see in terms of like the fabric of applications that are both composed but also applications that are now made up of microservices. When you came into this era, it was those composed applications were just beginning to emerge, and we were seeing the emergence of new thinking about APIs. We were thinking about how cloud services worked. Now we're in a dimension of thinking about how components work and how do components behave with databases. What's going on out there, what you guys are seeing with Redis and microservices? I'm just curious on what your take is.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's good to be back, both hanging out with you and also back at Redis Labs. I took a year off over at Intel. Actually, had a great time over there in their deep learning group.
Oh, cool. What did you
Yeah.
do there?
I was primarily focusing on a deep learning framework called Big DL
Okay.
that only runs in Spark, but it brings deep learning capabilities to Spark.
Oh,
And
neat.
So it was a great adventure for me. Actually, I really enjoyed my time
I
over there.
bet.
But Redis Labs raised a big round of funding, invited me back to head up ecosystem, and it was just a great opportunity. So fortunate to have them invite me back.
Can't beat that. Welcome back.
Thank you. Yeah.
So you're
So
out there, you're talking to people. What is the
yeah, well,
service?
my
What's the
previous
microservices story? Tell me
yeah
what's going on.
yeah well, so my previous role, I was pretty much talking about Redis everything and anything really. In this particular role, I'm focused more on sort of the big, meaty, emerging areas where Redis makes a lot of sense. And microservices is definitely one of them. I kind of think of it as an evolving, it's an evolution, really. I'm sure you're very aware of this, but in the early days, we used to talk about how you take the traditional application that you would build and you would make some changes to it so that it could run effectively in the cloud. Simple things, like separating the database from the application, um, making the application stateless so it could scale horizontally.
What is it
Um,
about then the Redis architecture that does provide that kind of multi cluster capability that allows you to run it across different, across, different cloud environments?
well, that's what I was going to get at is that, we took that traditional app and we kind of made it into components
Mm-hmm.
so that each component could scale effectively the way it needed to scale. And when you're dealing with data that has a single source of truth somewhere, traditionally we're thinking of that data residing in an SQL database of some sort. And so initially with Redis, what would happen is that one single database was so important that you really wanted to make sure it could handle the ingestion of new data and any changes. But the read view, you would cache in Redis, and you could cache that in a very scalable way. So you can put the data in memory in Redis on all of your web servers, or even just simply on a separate server, so that your database that was handling that single source of truth would not get hammered as hard, and you could make sure that the data was getting into it or the changes were being made, whereas the reads could all be done from a Redis cluster or scaling out with Redis. So that was the early days of things, and that's really where Redis took off. That's why in pretty much every cloud today, all of the major clouds, but the cloud offers a form of Redis itself, and there are usually other forms of Redis as well. So I mean, it's quite possible that in the cloud, Redis is the most popular database because there's really only one type of cache that is super successful, like Redis. Of course, there's still Memcache out there.
There's Cassandra, right?
Yeah, but for Redis is incredibly lightweight. You don't see Cassandra as a service on every cloud. You just don't see that. You see Redis as a service on every cloud.
So how about these more specialized environments that we're starting to see that are kind of like new generation that came after you? There's several of them out there. There's lots of new kind of providers like CockroachDB.
Well, honestly, I'm not going to do justice trying to compare it to every single one
Sure.
out there. But
I'm just thinking about your peers mostly. Like, I'm curious. Like, what are those? You guys obviously have your strengths. What are some of the trade-offs that you guys have to make when you're thinking about, these thinking about your own strategy for your application architecture and how it's going to be appealing to developers?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me mention another strength that people don't typically know about, and that is that they think of Redis as being a key value store. It's actually more than that. It's a key data structure store. And what that means is that while it does have a key, which makes it incredibly fast, it has like somewhere around 9 or 10 different data structures plus more modules that give you the ability to store the data basically in the form in which your application needs. So it's not a one size fits all where it has to be SQL or it has to be document store or it has to be graph. With Redis, you really have all of those different modes, or they call it multimodal, where you can store the data in the form that's directly how your application needs. So not only is it incredibly fast, faster than anything else because of the key lookup in memory, but it's also faster that you can't measure because the data does not need to be transformed again into the format that your application needs. It just comes right out. And, not only do you have a key value, but you have a hash, you've got sets, you've got sorted sets, you've got lists, you've got bit arrays, you've got all these different, geospatial, just this tremendous, now we have streaming coming along. So you have all these different structures that allow the data to basically come right out in the format that your application needs. It makes it incredibly fast and incredibly flexible.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the use cases you're seeing with microservices?
Well, and by the way, just to answer your other question about what are the trade-offs. So one of the things that's interesting about Redis is that it is in memory first and foremost, but it also does store to disk, but it does that after it responds. And so what that means is sometimes you will, you'll get a response back saying, hey, thank you for the information, but it hasn't actually written to disk yet. And that's actually key to how Redis behaves. It's extremely fast that way. And so there are some use cases where that is appropriate. And there's some cases where you actually use Redis as your primary database because of that. You want that kind of speed. Things like session management, where you scale out your session data with perhaps some analytical information across dozens of instances of Redis. And you want to write to it and then continue responding to the user with the web page without having to wait for that acknowledgement that it's been written to disk. Because you're far more, it's far more critical for you to respond quickly than it is to, wait and make absolutely sure that analytics data has been written. And there's lots and lots of use cases like that. So that's why you see Redis being so massively popular. The other thing is that to deal with the data to make sure that it has actually been captured correctly, if you want to, and many people do this, they won't write to disk before they respond, but they'll write to memory on another server and then respond. And that way you have a copy of the data on the master and the replica before you respond. And it's incredibly fast that way. And then the replica will do the work of saving to disk. And so you actually get the best of both worlds now, like this kind of cloud native strategy of using the cloud for what it's best at has really worked out well for Redis, and maintaining the speed that everyone loves, plus also the reliability, knowing that that data is now durable. So it's really a new way of thinking about speed and reliability, HA, all that kind of stuff.
So speed and reliability. So tell me more about the speed angle then, and how you're thinking about optimization of the database in these environments where you have lots of containers, for example, kind of in a microservices architecture. It might be on Docker, right? On their platform. It might be, it's often on Kubernetes, right? It's on Pivotal Kubernetes, right?
Again, like part of the reason why I came back over here is I've known Redis was going to be very popular in containers, but it is the most popular database on Docker Hub for downloads. And I think part of the reason for that is that Redis makes a ton of sense in a container, in a microservices, in a Kubernetes environment. Primarily because the more services you have, the more independent services you have, the more chatty they become. In other words, the more services that actually need to talk to that original, source of truth that might be a SQL database. And so the more you're going to want to actually cache some of that data that's in the SQL database in Redis. And so you might have one SQL database with maybe a backup or something, but you might have 10 Redises, right? Each fronting that database for their own microservices. And this is why, like at Netflix, which is, as you know, one of the sort of poster children for microservices for many, many years, they use a massive amount of Redis, just a massive amount.
Mm-hmm.
So, I view the future usage scenarios for Redis seem unlimited.
There's some case studies out there. There's a flywheel case study there's a story by Carlos Justiniano. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that as to help us kind of illustrate.
Yeah, so Carlos, I saw that case study. In fact, I saw that case study and then invited him to come and speak at RedisConf. So he will be at RedisConf, which is April 25th and 26th in San Francisco. Carlos will be there. He's talking about a microservices framework that he has created that only uses Redis as the database. So that's the only database that the framework needs. And it's written in Node.js. So if you're interested in Node.js and microservices, you should definitely check it out. It's called Hydra. And really it comes down to exactly what I mentioned earlier, where you've got these data sets out there that are the SQL store, where you want to have data that's stored permanently for reporting or whatever other long-term use case that you need. But for everything that's more microservices, where it's interactive, where you're dealing with real-time users, you might put that in Redis and just spin up lots of Redis. And Redis is so small that you can actually run Redis on each one of your web servers, so that your cache is literally on the same server as your code, which means that you don't have network traffic. Or you can put it off on a shared database. So if you want to make sure that every web server can access the same exact data, you can put it off on a network-based database that is separate from your SQL data, so that, again, you're not impacting your SQL data. So it's a very good use case, and Carlos is I'm pretty excited to have him come and speak about it at RedisConf.
So that's so MySQL is like so what's the role of MySQL then in that environment?
Well, MySQL, I joke now, but things have gotten so fast, and MySQL is not slow, but it's by no means as fast as Redis, not even close. And so things have gotten so fast now that I kind of look at MySQL as cold storage. It's like, okay, you put it there, that's where your data lives permanently in large amounts, and you can use that for historical reporting, or like I said, your single source of truth for maybe like what the current product descriptions are, that kind of thing. And then your different microservices might pull data from that and store those descriptions in the services, or perhaps they store, customers who are shopping for that item in a shopping cart, or they store maybe the vendors, and it's all cached. But if you want to go and update that list, you would then write that into a SQL database somewhere. That's a single source of truth, and then that gets pushed out through some, there's multiple means to do that, like PubSub or whatever, out to the different Redis databases. So they get that information, within seconds.
A lot about microservices is almost like it's like this gigantic, fragile system in a way, though yet it is often quite resilient, right? I mean, it has to be fragile to some extent, so it can be almost continuously rebuilt, right? But it also has to be very resilient. A lot of that comes down, part of that does come down to like the speed of the, of the architecture, and that has to affect kind of like issues such as what Carlos talks about, is like presence and health monitoring.
Well, it does, and of course you want to do all that, but there are companies who have been replacing their SQL databases or their other databases simply because if your database can respond fast enough, that actually reduces the headaches you have when your database starts to get over its skis and starts to fall apart. So if you can scale out quickly, and your database can respond fast enough, like Redis can, then you're far less likely to start having these issues where you start seeing your database teetering, and it's about ready to fall over. So even though Redis is typically used in an in-memory manner, it actually ends up being more reliable because it fails less. And, I constantly am running into people out there who are like, oh, yeah, we use Redis. I'm like, well, do you need any, of Redis enterprise capabilities? And they're like, well, we just have this one instance. And to be honest, I probably haven't rebooted it in 2 years. It's like the darn thing just won't fall over. So there are definitely companies out there who would make that trade-off of I would much rather have the responsiveness and, the throughput that Redis gives me so that my failures are much fewer and far between, and I will make a trade-off that my data gets written to disk a fraction of a second later than it would have if I was using something like MySQL.
Fascinating. So one of the things that we're starting to see as we start to think more about microservices and container architectures, and in these very deeply sophisticated underlying orchestration engines, is beyond that we're seeing many more stories and many more examples of how there's a much more progress in how you use nodes, right, and how you kind of like leverage a node infrastructure out on the edge. Tell us about Redis's uses in that respect, and are you seeing more interest in this as a way to use Redis?
Well, definitely. So there's again, Redis is fairly small. An empty Redis database is 3 megabytes.
Mm-hmm.
It's and it's able to do that because Salvatore, who the creator and maintainer of Redis, he looks at every line of code that gets contributed or that he writes, and he makes sure there's not redundancies, which leads to fewer errors and more reliability. So and a smaller set of code, so that it's very small and very reliable. So you can put it out on the edge. You can even put it on a Raspberry Pi if you'd like. And so basically, when you're dealing with nodes out on the edge or even the IoT devices themselves, you can run Redis on all of that. Yeah, we're seeing that.
Mm-hmm. So
Redis streaming comes out. I don't think it's been officially announced, but it'll probably be announced at RedisConf in 3 weeks for GA. And so streaming will definitely have a lot of users and use cases, both on IoT devices, but also in microservices.
So when you are talking about a streaming engine, what are you guys talking about specifically? What is that streaming engine, and what's happening now? Why would you invest your engineering resources here?
Well, and by the way, and it's being created by Salvatore, so it's just all going to be in the open source, and then Redis Labs will of course provide some value around that, yet to be determined. But the main use case is basically a Kafka use case. The main difference between what I see is that it'll be faster, but it won't be. I'm guessing it won't be as it won't write to disk as much, right? So it'll prefer to just receive the information, store it for a period of time. You can probably do windowing where you can, analyze data in Windows as the data goes through, and then passes it on to where it needs to go. So, it'll probably be a very Kafka scenario, but its focus will be on data that you're not going to store on disk on that instance. Instead, you're just going to push it on through to where it needs to go.
Great. So you have the big conference coming up. What are some of the topics that you're seeing come through that are going to be discussed at the conference?
Yeah, so we got 75 speakers. It's last year we had 50, I think. So it's been growing steadily every year. And there's of course the traditional, here's what's new with Redis, and or some of the others are here's how we're pushing the boundaries of Redis. I think there's multiple titles, probably 5 or 6 talks out there where the word billions is in the title. Big companies, fast companies using lots and lots of Redis. Twitter, I think, is probably the most famous. I don't know exactly. I think they've created their own databases and they used Redis in there. I think they were one of the first early adopters of Redis back when Twitter was having trouble scaling. You probably remember those early days. Redis is really what helped it scale. Because back there, and then, if you recall, there was a Ruby on Rails shop, and Rails is not known for storing data efficiently and for speed.
Right.
So Redis really came in there and saved the day, and then I think they've made lots of alterations, but they still use a massive amount of Redis. I don't know if this is true, but I think I heard somewhere where they use like thousands of instances of Redis. So you'll see lots of companies like that, literally using thousands of instances of Redis. And some of those companies will be at RedisConf speaking about that. But we also have talks on microservices, cloud native, Kubernetes related environments. I know that Ryan from Red Hat is speaking about using the new Red Hat Service Catalog to develop applications using Redis. I know the folks from Cloud Foundry are talking, Abby Kearns is speaking from Cloud Foundry, but the folks from Pivotal are speaking about different cloud native use cases, lots of microservices talks. Carlos, as we mentioned before, we're talking about Hydra. So, and I was responsible for the cloud native and DevOps tracks, which include all of those. So, we had to turn away a lot of really interesting talks. I was really disappointed. Folks from HashiCorp, I couldn't believe we had to turn them away, but they I found them too late. So I'm going to try to find an opportunity for them.
Oh yeah, I mean that's kind of it's a new area for you guys in some respects, and thinking about how you interact in these organizations and how you kind of get to know the ecosystem and stuff. Are you starting to find different Pivotal obviously you work with, but there's lots of issues that come with databases when you start thinking about microservices, such as just monitoring and observability, and those are kind of key acute issues. You're starting to talk to people about how those, like these cloud native technologies might integrate more seamlessly with Redis.
Yeah, well, so First of all, we have partnerships with many of the companies you would consider cloud native. And one of the topics that comes up or has come up recently is the concept of cloud native data and how that is different than cloud native application code. And the primary difference is that with application code, your primary goal is to be able to push new changes quickly so that you can get feedback from users and keep innovating rather than waiting for 6 weeks or so to push new code. And but within the data side of the house and the cloud native data side of the house, you're not pushing a new data or pushing new databases quickly. Typically, your databases don't change that much. And instead, what you're dealing with is data that's changing. So the data itself is changing live, and now you have pushed new code for your application, and that code may need the data to be in a slightly different shape. So now how do you deal with that? You've just made some new changes. Your database needs to behave differently now. And instead, what you're dealing with. So, and how do you handle the fact that your data is, by very nature, stateful, which is
right
what you're trying to do. So there's some challenges there. And with a traditional database, like a SQL database, your data is sitting on disk, attached to that database, right?
Right.
And so you might not want to change it very often. It's your jewels, especially as we move more and more to this world of where data is your advantage. So you might leave that as it is and not change it that often, but you can cache in Redis and make your changes there so that when you go to read the data from the disk, you put it in Redis in the shape that your application wants, and then that is how you can handle at least the immediate change. And then eventually, once you've decided that this is the change that you permanently want, you might go and make the final change to the database. But that's something you might put a lot more, testing into, or validation before you make that permanent change to the SQL schema.
Lots of topics to explore, Dave. I think we could talk for weeks on these, on this subject matter. But I want to thank you for taking some time to talk. So you have your Redis conference coming up. Your guys are going to be, I'm sure, out and about. But we'd love to keep in touch as you're kind of continuing to get involved in the cloud native community and discussing microservices and the architectures behind them. Your contributions would always be greatly appreciated. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, you bet. And we look forward to seeing you out at the Cloud Foundry Summit and
yeah.
beyond.
Yeah, and Fifi says hello. So I'll just so there's Fifi. Oh. All right, Dave.
A little extra reward for anybody who's listening. If you would like to come to RedisConf, I have a free promo code.
Okay.
A free pass. It's just simply the word ecosystem.
Ecosystem.
So when you register, use the word ecosystem in the promo code area, and you will get a free pass.
Awesome. Well, Dave, have a great weekend.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Alex. You too.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye. I'm going to go into